Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
Was Tua Tagovailoa right for airing the Miami Dolphins' dirty laundry of seasons past? Also, which quarterback will win you your fantasy league? And the whole Tua Tagovailoa story just points to how important it is to have an offensive-minded coach.
I'm Peter Bukowski, starting your day with the can't-miss stories and biggest debates in sports. You're Locked On Sports Today.
Searching all major sports. Found.
Let's start with the biggest story.
Tua Tagovailoa was a $50 million man this offseason. He was part of one of the memes that just would not die as well through no fault of his own. And now he's back in the headlines talking about his old coach in relationship to his new coach. Kyle Krabs from Locked On Dolphins and, of course, Locked On NFL Scouting joins me now. And Kyle, the discussion that has resulted from Tua essentially saying Brian Flores treated him like he never wanted him to be there has been startling to me. What did you learn in these comments from Tua?
I don't know necessarily that I learned anything new from what Tua had to say, because people around the team have kind of heard the horror stories from the past few years. And it makes sense on one hand, too, where the team goes on and wins 8 out of 9 games to close the 2021 season after a horrific start and multiple or back-to-back winning seasons with Brian Flores. And they still made the decision to part ways and go in a different direction. And I think when you reflect with the benefit of hindsight, that decision was not made lightly. Now, at the time, you could reflect on the team choosing to stay the path with a young quarterback that they had drafted 5th overall and contrast his resume at the time playing for Brian Flores versus Brian Flores and the defensive metrics and rankings and the success and the team wins that came, and speculate whether or not they had made the right decision. But for the things that Tua Tagovailoa alluded to when speaking to Dan Le Batard, I think it's an affirmation for the health of that entire workplace environment and locker room. What was happening with Brian Flores and the Miami Dolphins was not a sustainable path forward if the team wanted to do what they have done since, which is maintain some level of success and now have back-to-back trips to the postseason and a quarterback who has earned a second contract with the team to try to take things to another level.
I'm going to ask you to put on your scouting hat here for a second. It did make me wonder how many quarterbacks have been discarded or left by the wayside by a coach that just didn't click with them, didn't vibe with them, didn't know how to use them. Yeah. Because the difference between the version of Tua we saw with Brian Flores and the one, okay, Mike McDaniel might be one of the best offensive coaches of like the last decade, but it does make you wonder a little bit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And Joe Marino and I, for the show that we do on Locked On NFL Scouting, several years ago, we had Jordan Palmer on. Jordan Palmer, very well-renowned quarterback trainer.
Sure.
And the quote that he gave us that has stuck with me ever since is teams bust on quarterbacks more than quarterbacks bust on teams. With the environment. And you know, I get it with how popular the league is. It's so easy to consider these guys the extensions of the Madden avatars that you play with on your video games. There's human beings here. There's a whole other element behind the curtain of what you see with helmet and shoulder pads on Sundays. And whether it's scheme, Brian Flores couldn't find anybody by year 3 to run his scheme. He had co-offensive coordinators with assistants that were on the staff the previous year, and brought in Tua's Charlie Fry, who was like with Tua Elite 11, was the quarterback's coach, and he called plays for the first month of the season because they had no idea how to build around Tua. So it's become very obvious that the Brian Flores preferred pathway in the 2020 NFL draft was not the path that the team ultimately took with the players that they drafted. And when that happens at that early infancy stage of, they had 3 first-round picks in that draft class. Now, 2 of them have gone on to get second contracts, but 2 of them, Austin Jackson and Tua Tagovailoa, did not play well at all in the Flores era. So you as an organization have to be on the same page with this kind of stuff. And the Dolphins really between making the picks that they did and the Flores situation and how it went through 2021. They did everything wrong to try to derail their own progress. And that's when I think about that Jordan Palmer quote of teams busting on players. That's the kind of stuff that you're talking about.
Let's shift gears here to this year's defense, because Vic Fangio now out the door. It's some drama there too. There were certainly some players who have not made their disdain for Vic Fangio's approach a secret. And now Anthony Weaver coming in from the Baltimore Ravens. But from a personnel standpoint, there's some talent to like here, especially once they can get healthy. What do you think these changes will do? How do you think they will manifest themselves ultimately for this team this year?
Well, just to kind of bridge the two conversations, you mentioned players and their disdain for Vic Fangio. Javon Holland went on with Ryan Clark and Shannon Crowder, and he talked about, we were Vic Fangio's pupils, but we could tell he didn't want to be here. And he was with Philadelphia. There was the tampering thing with Jonathan Gannon where he leaves. Vic ends up in Miami, and they asked him if the tampering thing would have happened, would you been in Miami? And he didn't directly answer the question. And then they mutually parted ways. And within 12 hours, he was in Philadelphia being introduced as like the defensive coordinator of Philadelphia. So the biggest consistent thematic change with every player that you've spoken to at training camp about this defense has been the way that Anthony Weaver, as a former player, involves them in a lot of the decision-making process and the game planning process to put players in positions where they feel like they're going to be successful. And that was kind of the antithesis of what Fangio was, which is, we're a static shell. You're going to be left corner. You're going to be free safety. You're going to be the Mike linebacker. We're going to have the same defensive presentation every single play. This Weaver defense, with the versatility of guys like Jalen Ramsey, who extended his career at a all-pro Pro Bowl level by being moved around and playing in the nickel with the Rams for his last 2 years. He played exclusively outside corner other than one game last year against the Jets, where he himself made the decision on the field that he was going to travel and follow Garrett Wilson, which was not the game plan. So things like that, Calais Campbell, I think about the experience that this group has with Jordan Poyer in Buffalo and Jalen Ramsey and Calais Campbell. Those guys they went so young at the start when they built this thing back up all over again, that the struggles that they've had, some of the thought process is, we need guys that have been here, have been experienced, understand what it takes. And they're hoping that plus the scheme change, which all the players are going to be more bought into because they feel more a part of the process, is going to yield better results.
Stay up to date on the Miami Dolphins all year long by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Dolphins on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Thanks for making Locked On Sports Today your first listen. Coming up, who's the quarterback that will win you your league? Before we answer that, Aaron Rodgers is having a difficult training camp. His words. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV-based plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment you can cancel anytime. For that $5 bet, you could look at NFL Future. The running game has been out of the spotlight for a few years now, but that doesn't stop us from looking at props for, say, the season's leading rusher. FanDuel likes Christian McCaffrey to accomplish it. He's got 7-1 odds to do it. Jonathan Taylor and Bijan Robinson are tied at plus 850. Breece Hall rounds out the players with odds better than 10-1. He's plus 950. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Robert Saleh told Aaron Rodgers to expect a tough Jets training camp this year. Rodgers said Tuesday, Saleh was right.
I would say the camp is much harder this year and maybe the hardest in the last 7 or 8 of my career. I knew that. I had a little insight coming into camp that's what Robert wanted to do. So I think it's been good for us. There's a lot of different schools of thought, and there's always, people you can scapegoat as far as injuries and different things. But I think some of the older guys enjoy the, to steal a coaching word, the callous part of training camp where you're kind of grinding. And some people believe that although it puts more, strain on you in training camp, that actually gets you more ready to play when the season starts. And then some people believe the opposite. And you know how it goes. Whatever teams are having success, people kind of look at their schedule and go, let's do that.
The Oxnard Fire Department and police were called to the Dallas Cowboys training camp at River Ridge Residence Inn on Tuesday because of a fire in one of the guest rooms. The fire was contained to one room that was empty at the time, and nobody was injured, according to the team. The Cowboys take over the entire campus of the River Ridge Residence Inn for players, coaches, front office staff, support staff, and other personnel. No non-Cowboys personnel stay on the property during the team's stay in California. If you believe in things like omens, portents, it's not the best. On the diamond, the Braves came up with a key win over the Phillies.
The Atlanta Braves get a great start from Ronaldo Lopez and his return from the injured list, and the Braves get a huge win over the Philadelphia Phillies 3-1 on Tuesday night. Jake Mastriani here from Locked On Braves. And look, it's been a rough 24 hours here with the news of Austin Riley and him being done for the rest of the regular season, but there are still games to be played. There is still plenty of talent on this Braves team, and in a big series against their division rivals, they're able to come away with a win and a great pitching matchup. Ronaldo Lopez looked fantastic, 5 innings, career-high 10 strikeouts in this one, went toe-to-toe with Zach Wheeler. Marcell Ozuna with the big home run. Ramon Laureano with 3 great catches in the final inning to wrap things up. The offense did just enough in this one. And look, this is going to be the key for the Braves going forward. It is going to be all about that pitching, and having Ronaldo Lopez back and the way that he pitched on Tuesday night certainly will help. We'll cover it more over in the postcast with me and Grant McCauley, and we'll touch on this game more on next Locked On Braves.
It's that time of year again, the most wonderful time of the year, some say. Fantasy football draft season. Want to win your league? You've got to check out Locked On Fantasy Football, where they recently looked at some quarterbacks who can win you your league.
They can kind of be the poor man's version of what we have with Allen, Hurts, and Jackson in terms of their production kind of dual threat, right? I mean, this is why you kind of have to separate them. That's how I kind of did it in my head as well, I think. But we need to talk about your outlier of Dak Prescott, too.
Yeah, so I was shocked. You have Dak Prescott a lot lower than I do. I am at 6 here. Quarterback 5. I have him at quarterback 5. I do have Kyler Murray at 4, but they're in the same tier. You have him all the way at quarterback 11 in your tier 3 quarterbacks. I'm shocked by that because of how consistently good Dak Prescott has been, especially, last year we saw him be the quarterback 4, right, on the season. Quarterback 1 from week 6 through 18. He had 7 top 4 quarterback finishes during the year last year. And he's been a top 4 quarterback in points per game in 3 of the last 5 seasons. He has the same system with Mike McCarthy. Unless you're expecting CeeDee Lamb not to play the full season, how do you have him so low? What's the reasoning for your quarterback 11 ranking for Dak?
Well, it's simple. I think there's going to be a lot of scoring in front of him, and his numbers could be similar, but I think everything has to line up well. Keep in mind there were some things that didn't happen. Joe Burrow was not himself. You had Anthony Richardson, a guy that we ranked pretty high. He got hurt and was not available to consistently put up points either. So there was a couple guys that could squeeze him down. I think there's a higher trajectory now for CJ Stroud, but I think these are pretty close. I think this is why I have a pretty big tier 3. I'll admit I have from 7 to 13. So I think a lot of these guys are similar. It kind of tells you that there's really good value here in the draft. And if these tiers are similar, then I want to wait for Dak Prescott. Now, I think he'll go earlier in some drafts, but I think a lot of these guys there that are outside of the top 6 are really kind of similar. And you could see any of these guys jumping into the tier 2 with their production. So Dak, it's not more so that I don't like Dak. I just like a few other guys a little bit more. One of those guys we both love here, and you like him a little less. You have him behind Dak Prescott, but this is definitely more aggressive than the market, Jaden Daniels. I have him at 6. You have him at 7. Are we crazy? Are we going too overhyping? By the way, as we're recording this, he is officially named the Washington Commanders starter.
No, I really don't think we're overhyping it. I mean, we saw what a good rushing quarterback he was last year in college. He led all FBS quarterbacks with over 1,100 rushing yards, averaged 8.4 yards per carry. Like last year, the top 3 fantasy quarterbacks were 3 of the 4 quarterbacks that had 500 plus rushing yards last year. Allen, Hurts, and Lamar. The other one was Justin Fields. He was a little bit lower there, but he's also just explosive with his arm. He's great with those deep throws. Like he's going to come down with some deep passes, those chunk plays, and then also so many rushing yards. I can't imagine he doesn't get 500 plus rushing yards. I would imagine 700 plus, right? So that's why I have him pretty safely as a top 7 guy. I might be too low on him.
Yeah, he's going to score a lot of touchdowns, by the way. I mean, they're using him early. If you look at some of the preseason work, I mean, I don't think he even needed really the preseason. It was just like, here's some highlights you want to add just to make sure that I'm the starting quarterback. But he was running. He was making it look easy throwing downfield. I love the system with Cliff Kingsbury. We know that path has led to Kyler Murray being very productive and being a top 7 fantasy quarterback. So everything is there. I think Daniel's talent is just so tantalizing. And the weapons are there. He's got plenty of weapons. The running game, look, he could steal a lot from that as well with Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler. Like, he's not necessarily going to force checkdowns to those guys. He could also run it in the red zone, which is great. So, yeah, I think 500 yards rushing is easily there for him, Michelle, as you mentioned. But I also think he has a lot of TD upside overall in this offense. So I'm excited. I'm going to draft him in a lot of leagues now. Everyone's probably going to know that and chase him down, but you can't help but
his price is definitely increasing as we get closer to draft.
I mean, it could be this price at the end, right? When you're drafting like a couple days before the season starts, I would not be surprised if Jaden Daniels is high. I'm sure he's going to have a spike now that he's officially the starter. I don't know who would have thought he wasn't going to be the starter at this rate, but he's now a guy that hopefully you're drafting early or did some best ball drafts and you're able to get Jaden Daniels a little cheaper. But
win your fantasy football league by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Fantasy Football on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Coming up, score another point for offensive coordinators. Every year, you see a bunch of new head coaches emerge from the offensive coordinator spot, or even further down the offensive coaching tree. As Locked On NFL hosts James Rapien and Chris Carter discuss, this Tua Tagovailoa news may show why that's such a prudent choice.
You know what this kind of hammers home for me? I want an offensive mind around my young quarterback. That's what it does. I think because offensive minds can find the strengths. And they know that their job is dependent on making Tua great. Mm-hmm. Maybe Brian thought, well, if I win despite this bad quarterback, I'm just going to be here and I'll be able to survive this quarterback and get the next guy. And an offensive mind, I think, would realize that his success, failure, job is tied to the 5th overall pick. And Brian should have felt that way anyways. Like, players last probably a year longer than coaches, GMs usually, and in an attempt to get the most out of them. We've seen that across the league for many, many years. But yeah, I if you are taking the guy 5th overall, even if you have your doubts, if you're Brian Flores, you got to try.
There's no easier, more direct route to being good than having a good quarterback and a good offense. And what happens when you have a defensive coach is, even if you also have a good quarterback, if you have a cavalcade of offensive coaches and schematic upheaval, that can stymie your offense. And when your offense isn't clicking, if you have a defensive head coach, they're not always the most adept at finding solutions. If you're an offensive-minded head coach, you're Matt LaFleur, you're Kyle Shanahan, you're Sean McVay, you're Mike McDaniel, and you have a quarterback that you click with, there's no fear that they're going to be snatched away by another team and all of a sudden you have to start over. And just because, and we've learned this from time immemorial in sports, in the NFL in particular, just because you come from the right tree of coaches doesn't mean you can recreate that success. We saw this for years with Mike Holmgren and the West Coast offense, and we're seeing it now in the NFL. Though the Shanahan tree has been successful, it hasn't been quite as successful as Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay. So when you hire a defensive coach, it better be because that defensive coach could also solve your problems on offense if they arise. But there's a reason why all of these teams are handling it this way. The quickest, the most direct way to being good is through offense, is through your quarterback. And having continuity there makes that a little easier. And finally, remember when we said that Mike Gundy told his players to stop thinking about the money they can make through name, image, and likeness? Oklahoma State will have a QR code on their helmets that people can scan, and it will link to their NIL fund. The idea is fans watching on TV can scan it and donate it. But are you going to pause the TV? If you're in the stadium, how are you going to benefit from this in any way? The people who are going to actually be physically the closest to these QR codes? This feels like tricking your players into thinking you're giving them a cool opportunity. And this will never, ever turn into any sort of money-making opportunity for anyone. If you're catching this episode after hearing your favorite Locked On show, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Also, if you're a new subscriber to Locked On Sports Today, we're here for you with the biggest stories in sports every day. Coming up on the next Locked On Sports Today, who's the main sleeper you need to target in your fantasy football draft? So at least until tomorrow, stay locked on sports today.
Locked On Podcast Network presents Locked On Sports Today.
For more episodes of Locked On Sports Today, go to our video on demand. Click on sports at the top of your screen. There, you'll find past episodes of Locked On Sports Today, plus other Locked On shows on demand.